people often ask when they're doing these archaeological excavations, and I guess for the Nephites or Lamanites, this would have to apply to the pre-classic sites. Why aren't we finding when they're excavating these places King Benjamin or Nephi or
Yeah.
Mormon or Moroni? Why aren't we finding those names of characters from the Book of Mormon? And are they finding names of people that lived in the pre-classic period?
But it took a long time before they found that one stone that had his name on it. So you could say, here it was. Well, how did we know that they were there? Well, it was writing. If we don't have the writing, we can't tell. And, based on what we see in the old world, it's extremely difficult to come up with that. So why do we know things in the old world? Because the old world has better retention of ancient names than we do in the new world. Names in the new world got mixed up with multiple cultures, multiple times, multiple places. So we don't have the ancient names of these sites.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Well, I thought maybe I could transition. I don't think we'll get through everything I wanted to cover, but we'd always do like another episode at some point. But I want to ask you just a few questions on archaeology. We've kind of already touched on this, but I just want to sort of leave no stone unturned and maybe in a couple of minutes, maybe address some of these criticisms people bring up to be like, why don't we find this? Why not this? So the thesis is in John Sorensen's book and your book is that a party of about 30 Israelites, the Lehite party, come over to the Americas, that there already were thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people living in Mesoamerica. You talk about in the highlands of Guatemala, that there was a few thousand people, different communities. So
in the foothills, in the foothills near the coast of Guatemala, where Sorensen suggests, and I think it's a reasonable suggestion, where the Lehites would have landed, up in these foothills so they can see the ocean, there were 6 communities of a minimum of 1,000 each. So you got at least 6,000 people who can see the ocean and who could look out and say, hey, what's that sail coming? What's that thing? So I think that the ship that Lehi was in was met on the coast from people coming down going, I wonder what this is. I've been watching you come. So yeah, I think there were lots of people there, and I suspect they were even met by people when they landed.
Right, and we know from the text that Nephi becomes king. So someone might wonder, like, doesn't it seem strange that these newcomers coming to where there's already more people that Nephi becomes king, and then they sort of have like this lineage history that sort of revolved around them. And Liam and Lemuel, is there any indication in the text that they also become sort of rulers of who they intermingle with as well?
There's nothing the text says about that. Anything you would say would be conjecture. We do have later a King Laman, and so now it's a question of, does that name show up because the Lamanites kept it, or does it show up because it's a Nephite record that's being written, and so you want a King Laman? Either of those fit historically to the way historical records were created. So yes, it could have been a name that was ancient. Yes, it could have been a name that was put in there because it fit the way the writer wanted to write the history. And no way to know what that is.
And so would you see the text of the Book of Mormon that it's kind of either like an ethnocentric, or like Sorensen describes it as like a lineage history? And when they talk about other tribes, but they talk about like Nephites, Jacobites, Ishmaelites, Lemuelites, Lamanites. Yeah. So they're designating different people by like these tribal names, but are these names that the Nephite authors are assigning? Because we don't have like Samites, for example, or when they encounter the Mulekites. Are they even called the Mulekites in the text? But after that they, meet with the Nephites, they're no longer considered.
Mulekite never shows up.
Okay.
Mulekite is a name that we have invented and given to that people. It's not a Book of Mormon name.
And so that tribe doesn't exist. And as soon as they meet and mingle with the Nephites.
Mulek is interesting because much, much later than the confluence of the Nephites and the people of Zarahemla, who are descended from this Mulek, Um, we aren't told about that until really late. I think it comes in, is it in Alma or Helaman? I forget where. Um, but it takes a long time before we ever see that name Mulek. And the name Mulek is interesting because it's an MLK name. And we show the way Mormon uses these MLK names. Uh, so it is, I think, a legitimate question as to whether or not there really was this son of Zedekiah, or if this is the way Mormon has cast the story so that he can have an antithetical parallel between two peoples coming out of Jerusalem and say, look, you started right. Nephites have done this. You guys have kind of taken the other side. Uh, uh, the more I read Mormon, the more that makes sense to me. Orson Scott Card actually presented that information, shoot, in 1970 something maybe. And there are a lot of things. It's an article called Artifact or Artifice. And look it up on the internet. Put Orson Scott Card, Artifact or Artifice. You should find the article. Yeah, and it's a wonderful article because it comes from his perspective as a writer, saying, if a writer were doing this, this is what it would look like, and the Book of Mormon doesn't look like that. There's certain things about it that are, I think, really insightful. But one of the things he does is suggest that maybe the Mulekites was a made-up name. And I read a review of that article by Jeff Lindsay from like 20 years later. And he's talking about how good the article was, how important it is. And he skims over that particular part saying, yeah, that's worth reading. I think it really is worth reading. I think that was an interesting idea. And the longer I've read the text, the more I'm coming around to that.
But wait a minute, would this not undermine or challenge the discovery of that stamp seal found in Jerusalem of Malchiah, son of the king?
Connected. Yeah, it would say that's a coincidence rather than a connection.
Oh no, you can't take that away.
It would undermine that. Yeah, the apologetics behind that would change.
Oh boy. Okay, so one question, I don't know if you can really answer this per se, but it's also I'm trying to make sense of Nephites and Lamanites being in Mesoamerica. I'm sort of wondering, because if there was 30 of them when they arrived and they're intermingling with thousands around them, I'm sort of curious, when Alma goes and preaches to different Nephite cities, and he goes Gideon and Ammonihah, and he's leaving from Zarahemla. I'm sort of wondering how many of the Nephites are actually descendants of the Nephites, how many of them are just natives that have been adopted, who's a descendant, who's not. Do you have any idea, sort of, I guess obviously we can't know, but percentage wise, how many are maybe descendants of Nephi? Because for example, when he goes to, I think it's Ammonihah, doesn't Amulek identify himself as a descendant of Nephi? So maybe not everyone is actually a descendant of Nephi who's a Nephite. So what do you think about that?
We have concepts of sort of patriarchal lineages where we go back and we say, this is my line. I can go back and I can name a male ancestor. It is entirely possible that they had people who could do that and say, I'm actually descended from Nephi himself. That's possible. It would never, excuse me, be what you might call a pure lineage, a pure Nephite lineage. So you might be able to say this person Nephi, but that person Nephi's son probably married someone who was non-lineal. They had a child who was therefore non-lineal, who married a child who was non-lineal. And so if you're talking about genetics, there are no pure Nephites left after a couple of hundred years. And by the time Mosiah the first is leaving the land of Nephi, you're getting up to 400 years. There are no pure Nephites left. So you might have a genealogy that would legitimately trace to Nephi. It's possible. It is also possible that you are designated as one of these tribes. But just like the tribes of Israel, they had fluid boundaries, and you wouldn't be a pure Benjamite. You would have other people who have come in, moved in. And so these become social definitions and not genetic definitions. So the genetic concept is very different from the social concept. And for anybody who's really interested in that discussion, there's a new book out, relatively new, well, last couple of months. It's the Let's Talk About series. And it's Let's Talk About DNA in the Book of Mormon.
Oh yes, I've
And
actually just ordered that with Ugo
oh
Perego
yeah,
and someone else. Can't
yeah,
remember the other author.
yeah. I don't remember the other one. I know Ugo, so I remember Ugo. Um, but if you want the word on DNA in the Book of Mormon, you read that one. There's all kinds of things that have happened before, but that one has all of the right information, all the most up-to-date stuff, and even talks about the problems that, let's say, the Heartland people have with using the X2A marker to say that the Book of Mormon took place here, because they talk about that issue and the fact that it's not correct. It was based on old information and some problems at the time, but they cover the bases, and it's a small, readable book.
I'm looking forward to reading that. What's sort of like we've
Yeah.
talked about DNA before, but what's sort of their basic, in a nutshell, response to if somebody says like, okay, even if a small group of Israelites came and intermingled with others, shouldn't we find at least, a little bit of like Middle Eastern DNA? Assuming that they would have had Middle Eastern DNA, why did it just disappear?
And again, I refer you to the book for the real answer to that one. The non-biological scholar answer, having read what they have talked about, uh, there's sort of two problems. One is finding the right skeletal remain that had that DNA. So if you have 1 million people who have died, and one of them contained, and let's say it's even 20, contained Israelite DNA, out of 1 million skeletons, have you examined the right one? Okay, so there's a problem. Just in the sampling, how do I find it? The other is, we don't know what that DNA looked like when it left Jerusalem, so we don't know what we're looking for. So from the scholar's standpoint, basically it is an unanswerable question. You cannot find it. You should not find it. It would be shocking to find um, anything that looked like Israelite DNA for the multiple reasons they discuss in that book. So yeah, quick answer is, yeah, you would not find it. You should not expect it. The people who are experts in historical genetic DNA or population genetics, they know they can't find it. And if the experts can't find it, the rest of us don't have much hope.
Yeah, I know as well. He talks a lot about like genetic drift and
Yeah, yeah,
population bottleneck and the founder effect. And I
yeah.
suppose like if it's 30
All of
Israelites,
those things are in that little book.
yeah,
Like I said, go to that book. If that's a question you have at all, please pick up that Let's Talk About DNA in the Book of Mormon. That is the answer to all of your questions.
yeah. I think I
By
remember reading a
experts,
quote
not by theorists.
by Simon Southerton, who is a scientist, but I remember he sort of conceded that okay, if the Book of Mormon did say
Yeah,
that it's like 30 Israelites intermingling with thousands or hundreds of thousands that were in Mesoamerica, then yeah, after a few generations, we probably wouldn't see a trace of their
yes.
DNA. But he would sort of argue that he doesn't believe that Book of Mormon allows for that. So it kind of shifts the discussion from okay, if they were only 30 people and they came where there's already lots of people here, perhaps
Yeah.
after a few
If,
generations.
uh, if the Book of Mormon were not historical, then it couldn't be historical. Now, what I mean by that is, if the Book of Mormon only talked about people of the Book of Mormon being the only people here, if that were true, that the Book of Mormon people were the only people in the New World, then you could show that the Book of Mormon was not true. But the
Yeah,
premise is not true, because they came into a world that was full of people. We know that archaeologically, historically. You can see the evidence of it in the text, even though they don't speak about it. You can see how it fits into the text. And one of the first places you see it is in the sermon that Nephi quotes, that he had Jacob. So King Nephi has his brother Jacob, who's a priest, present a sermon to the people. And what he does is he takes the text out of Isaiah. And again, here's the chapter of Isaiah, pulls the proof text out. And the proof text is all about how the Gentiles are going to save the people of Israel. You know, the people are going to come in the nursing mothers and and it all talks about how the Gentiles are actually going to be the salvation. Well, that doesn't happen in Israel for a very long time. It takes a long time for that to happen. It has zero relevance to a people who are absolutely all Israelites, and the only Gentiles they know of are in the old world. If the only Gentiles they know about are in a completely different place, this sermon that he gives based on that text is senseless, has no meaning whatsoever. If, however, you say, based on what the reality had to be, which there had to be other people there, and he's preaching to a mixed group, and he's saying, in this mixed group, these Gentiles who have joined you are your salvation. He's talking about unifying a people between the lineal and the Gentile outsiders who've come together. That makes sense. But it only makes sense in a real historical text. Now the question is it reasonably historical that an author would neglect to mention that there were other people there? Well, in an ancient text, yeah, sure. If you're only talking about your people, you don't really care about it. That's an event that was in the past. It doesn't fit into the story that Nephi is telling in First Nephi. And so there's no reason for Nephi to put it in there because it doesn't fit with what he's telling. You can just simply see it in the background. You see it early on. And again, this is in 2 Nephi chapter 5. Where he says, we're going to separate from the Lamanites. And I went with you, and he names all these people. He says, I took these people with me and all others who would go. Well, we know that Laman and Lemuel didn't, their families didn't. Basically, we know everybody who came, and we know who stayed, and we know who went. Who the heck are these all others that he's talking about? We pretty much know who everybody else was. Who are the all others? Well, he just doesn't mention who they are. He just says, yeah, everybody else is coming with me. Where did the others come from? That's not the issue. Now they're Nephites. They're coming with me. They're part of this group. And, and his idea is I don't want separation. I want a Nephite people. So from an ancient historian, document, is it reasonable that he wouldn't have mentioned it? Yes. From an historical standpoint, archaeologically, historically, anything we know about the New World, were there people here? Absolutely. I don't care where you place the Book of Mormon in the New World, there was somebody there.
Yeah.
So the whole idea that, if the Book of Mormon were the only people, you could prove that the Book of Mormon was not true, that's a correct statement. It's just based on the wrong premise.
Yeah, because I remember whenever I did my own video on DNA and the Book of Mormon, that's kind of what it came down to. And yeah, if you read the Book of Mormon, that they come to an empty land that's uninhabited and that all Native Americans descend from the Lamanites, then you could say, yeah, DNA disproves the Book of Mormon. We also know archaeologically there are already people here. So you're saying that this could be an explanation both for the DNA problem, but also that there's things in the text that if it is historical, there's things that don't make sense unless there are other people there, like the population growth of the Lamanites, or when we talked about like in Jacob with polygamy, that's not too long after they're there. So like, how does that work if they're taking extra wives, but they're all related with each other? Trade as well and costly apparel. You talk about how that you have to be trading with other societies.
Everything in the text tells you that there were lots of people there. And there are lots of people faster than population genetics would allow an isolated population to have created. Not to mention the fact that you got the icky idea of trying to marry your sister or your cousin. I grew up with these people, and I've got to marry one of them. It just doesn't work very well. And it works much better if you say, hey, this is an ancient historical document. Does it behave the way ancient historical documents do? Yes. Okay. Now, let's take another side of that. We start with the Book of Nephi. And I've mentioned that that's the wrong way to start. Well, the Book of Nephi was written after he had already written his story on the large plates. So Nephi is writing a different story for a very different reason. Does he have a reason to mention the others? No, it's not relevant to the way he is writing this. Is this his official record of exactly what happened? No, that's over here in the large plates. So in the large plates, it is entirely possible that in the large plates, he has a section on meeting people and where all these people came from. It's entirely possible that it was there.
Because, for example, when it mentions meeting the people of Mulek in what book is it in the small plates or in Mosiah, or is it both? But anyway, if we didn't have that,
it's the end of Omni that we get.
Omni, that's right. But then after that, they're never really spoken about much.
Yeah, I mean, should have been at the beginning of the Book of Mosiah, but we lost that. Then so we get that history from Omni. Because this is a secondary record that Nephi's writing, he intentionally says, I'm writing a different one than the other one. He intentionally separates this and says, this text, the small plates, are for a different purpose and a different reason. So the other ones that were the record of the kings and the doings, etc., could have had mention. Now, that's where Mormon took his text. Okay? Yeah, well, first of all, we don't have the large plates. We have what Mormon gave us from the large plates. Okay, so let's say that this is on the large plates, and there's a section there that talks about them meeting all of these people. Okay, Mormon is writing almost 1,000 years later. Does Mormon care about that? Nope, doesn't care. Isn't part of his story either. So it could have been on the large plates. That's a good place to have put it. But it shouldn't have been based on what we see of what's on the small plates, shouldn't have been there because of the way those are constructed. And the way Mormon's story is constructed, it might not have been there even, if we had the Book of Lehi, he may not have included that because it didn't matter. To Mormon, they've always been here. They've been here for 1,000 years. Why is that interesting? So it is entirely possible that what we had of Mormon's editing of the Book of Lehi might have skipped over that, even though it really was on the plates. And all of that fits with, again, what an ancient historian is doing. They're creating a story for their own reasons, not to satisfy what we wish we knew. There are any number of historical questions that I would love to ask Mormon because he left them out. But they weren't of interest to him.
And the Nephite and Lamanites designation, you would say reading the text carefully is more broad or complex than Nephites are just descendants of Nephi. Lamanites are just descendants of Laman. I think Jacob talks about that. Those who are friendly or sort of join with the Nephites or practice their religion are considered Nephites.
It becomes a political definition early on.
Yeah.
By Jacob's time, Nephite and Lamanite are essentially political. It's friend or foe.
Yeah, Lamanites are those. There's different definitions for Lamanites because it's those who all those who fight against the Nephites are considered Lamanites. Those who mix their seed.
Consider the parallel to the Old Testament. You've got Jew and Gentile. In the Book of Mormon, you have Nephite, Lamanites. It's very, very similar. It's insider, outsider.
And then at the very end, when the Savior comes and there's no more ites, then after that, like when there's the Nephite Lamanite designation again, that one's definitely political at that point. So what side you're on? Sure,
yeah, because I mean, if you've mixed up the tribes enough that it's your social memory of tribes is gone, it becomes the political insider outsider definition again.
I'll have to do a video myself. I know we did a full interview on that. On what does it mean? Who are the Lamanites? I want to just ask you a few rapid fire questions on just archaeology. I'll
see if I can do rapid answers instead of long ones.
Yeah. So this one's just archaeological evidence. So why don't we begin with someone might ask, like, if the Book of Mormon's historical and we have all these ancient names of cities in the text, why don't we find ancient names in Mesoamerica like Zarahemla or Ammonihah or Bountiful? Why don't we find those ancient names in Mesoamerica?
The really quick answer to that one is we know very few names of any of the ancient cities. And the ancient names that we know have come from recent archaeological discoveries in the Maya area from carved records. The Maya did not start carving until after the Book of Mormon is over. So if things perish that are perishable, which we've already talked about, In Mesoamerica, if it was perishable, if it was painted, if it was written, painted on paper, if it was painted on leather, if it was painted on stone, if you paint it on stone, the weather's going to take it off. So why don't we have it? Because the medium that was used to record it was erased and wasn't there. And so we simply don't have any names of anything during Book of Mormon times.
So the Book of Mormon times would have been more in the pre-classic Maya, is that right? And the classic Maya, is that sort of like after AD 250, 300, sort of around the end of the Book of Mormon?
Right. Yeah, so the end of the pre-classic is fading into this liminal period where it's starting into the classic, and the Book of Mormon is ending in that time period.
So we don't know the names of ancient cities during the pre-classic period of the Maya?
Nope, we don't know. We can guess. We can assume, for example, that I think it's Mutal is the ancient name for the city we know as Tikal. But Mutal, if I remember correctly, is reeds, and you get lots of reed names. And there aren't any reeds in that area, and I believe most of the reed names are bleeding out of central Mexico. And so it may be a sort of metropolis name. You get Tula or Talan, which is a place of reeds. You get Mutal, which is a place of reeds. There's something about that naming that is more generic than what we think of a name, and it may be later than saying this is the historical name. A lot of names that we have of places where we assume that it has a name have come from later names that have been imposed on it. Every once in a while, it's an archaeologist that's made it up. So, for instance, the major city in Highland Guatemala is called Caminaljuyu, and
which I can't pronounce, but
yeah,
that's the name of it.
It's a made-up name. Archaeologists, that's not what it was called. Nobody ever knew it by that name. We call it Caminaljuyu because that's what the archaeologists call it. It has no connection to history.
For a lot of those cities in Mesoamerica, a lot of them are the names archaeologists have given to them.
Frequently, yes. Yeah. Well, and for instance, the Olmec people. The Olmec people are called the Olmec because the archaeologists who discovered their remains called them Olmec because there was an Olmec people who lived in that area. And then they found out that these were much older than the Olmec people who lived in the area, but they'd already penned the name to it. So we call this Olmec for the wrong reason. We don't know what they called themselves, but we call them Olmec. And then to distinguish the people that gave them the name, they call them, I think, the Olmec Xicalonca, to say, okay, this is the different Olmecs. But yeah, the name Olmec is not ancient. It shouldn't be there. That's imposed.
Is that the same for the Maya as well? They didn't call themselves anciently Maya, did they?
Well, no, they would not have. Their language would be Maya, but you also have to understand that in the ancient world, you'd have very little conception of a large people. Your concept is, I'm this community, I'm this city. Right. And so if you ask, who are you? I'm this city. I'm this city resident. And you can speak the same language as the guy in the next city and says, are you the same? No, I'm this city, he's that city. We're completely different, even though they speak the same language.
Right, it's not the same as conception today, because I'm from Ireland. Everyone in this civilization, we're all Irish, but it's different in the ancient world. In ancient Mesoamerica, it'd be more like, this is our city, this is our tribe. They wouldn't have considered themselves all unified as Maya or Olmec.
No. And there were conglomerations of cities, and so you might say we are this city beholden to that king or something. But you would still be different than somebody else, even if you spoke the same language, if you were an enemy. And then then they had the Aztecs who came down and named a bunch of stuff. So everybody knows the city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico. Very influential, really, really, we have no idea what they call themselves. Teotihuacan is an Aztec name. That's what the Aztec called those ruins. We don't know what the people called themselves. We're not 100% certain we're even sure what language they spoke. So really, really important culture. And we don't know much about them. We don't know any kings. We don't know what their rulership was like and how they organized things. Don't know what their language was, although there's some indications that some of these paintings may have indicated language, but it's complicated. But the name is from the Aztecs and not from those people. So someone says, why don't we have the name Zarahemla? Multiple reasons, the most important of which is we don't have records of names until after the Book of Mormon is ended.
Right,
And
so
we
that's kind
don't.
of a limitation of archaeology that we don't know the names of these ancient
Yeah, I mean,
Mesoamerican
we have
cities during the
pre-classic
pre-classic
archaeology.
period.
Yeah, I mean, we got pre-classic archaeology, and we give those places names, but we don't know what their names were. So there's no stone that says this is the name of the city, because they didn't carve things during that time period. The
Okay.
carving of stones comes later.
Right, okay. So that kind of can't really say
Longer
it
answer than
debunks
I
the
said.
criticism, but it means that like it's sort of untestable in a way. It's not like we know
Yeah,
the names of all these ancient cities and none of them resemble it. We don't know what they were called anciently. Um,
right.
okay, so going with like Sorensen's geography model, which is the one that you espouse, like I'm guessing some of those cities have been excavated, although isn't it right to think that the classic sort of built over some of the pre-classic cities and monuments? Could you
Oh
maybe
yeah.
touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, they're finding out that, for example, again in Tikal had a very long history. It's just that everything kept building over the top of it in the same site. And in one case, they actually got lucky, and inside one of the newer pyramids that you can see, there was actually one of the pre-classic pyramids inside of it that was intact, that still had all of its red painting on. And we see these pyramids with all the naked stone, and we think that's what it was like. They were painted, and many of them red, or red with yellows. And I mean, this was a very colorful place, and we lose that because the paint's worn off. But you can see it in this one temple that was preserved inside of what was built over the top. So yeah, and then what happens with the archaeology, of course, is if you're going to restore a site, you restore it to when it was the coolest, which is the classic period. So you don't remove all of the really cool stuff to put the older thing out here. You restore it with what the tourists want to see, which is the classic period. So there is evidence of pre-classic, of course, but we don't know names. We don't know much about them. Even if something has been built over in the same site, we don't know if it retained the same name forever. Like I say, with Mutal might have been a translation of this place of reeds, which appears to be just this is an important city. So hard to tell.
So there's been some archaeological excavation of pre-classic sites, but mostly classic sites. Is that right?
If you're at a classic site and it has a pre-classic layer, they try to get to it, but they don't reconstruct it. So they will dig down in to see what they can find, and they will try to say in the pre-classic era it looked like this, but those are all like drawings. You don't get to see the physical buildings. And then, this is what gets reconstructed that you can go visit. So there are a few pre-classic sites that you can visit, and I visited a couple of them on a tour with Interpreter Foundation. Um, they're really unimpressive. They're really boring. They tend to be a lot smaller, not nearly as elegant, not nearly as cool as the later classic stuff. Thematically, they have a lot of themes that carried through, uh, but they weren't nearly as nice as the stuff that we see from the classic.
Hmm. So on a similar vein to why don't we find ancient city names, people often ask when they're doing these archaeological excavations, and I guess for the Nephites or Lamanites, this would have to apply to the pre-classic sites. Why aren't we finding when they're excavating these places King Benjamin or Nephi or
Yeah.
Mormon or Moroni? Why aren't we finding those names of characters from the Book of Mormon? And are they finding names of people that lived in the pre-classic period when they're excavating?
Uh, no, to my knowledge, we don't have any names of any person or any city. And why don't we? Again, they didn't carve them in stone. We don't get names until they carve in stone. When they carve in stone, then we get names. And the names are Maya names with Maya etymologies. But of course, that's what you expect. By the time they're carving in stone, we don't have any Book of Mormon people to leave their names around.
And there's no text coming from the pre-classic period, really, that they're finding?
No text. We don't have texts. Well, we have a text. We have one pre-classic text at San Bartolo. That's the one that was painted inside the temple that I said was a miracle that they found this painted text. So there's one. And that tells us that they did paint, they did write. What's interesting is that the Maya writing system that they use is obviously related to the one that's later carved in stone, but it's enough not the same that they can't translate the whole thing yet. There are glyphs that are not known because they're different from the later ones. So the Maya hieroglyphs that we can read are an evolved language from whatever they were doing in San Bartolo. Reformed Maya, if you will.
So then why don't we find lots of evidence of writing or long books or texts? Because someone might say, like, oh, the Book of Mormon makes it seem like they're very literate people, so why are they not being preserved? Is it because they're not being carved in stone or in metal, so they just don't last?
And the Book of Mormon says that. It says if we don't write on metal, it won't be preserved. It'll perish. And the Book of Mormon says that, and it's probably more true than not. That area eats things. It just is very, very hard on archaeological remains. If it isn't, stone, carved in stone, it tends to disappear. So they had lots of codices by the time Diego de Landa is burning them, but they're modern productions. They're productions that they have made. We just don't have anything that was preserved from pre-classic times that I'm aware of. There is one codex that was found in a temple, but I don't remember what epoch it comes from. But we can't read it because all the pages are fused together and we can't separate them without destroying it. So there's that one, but we just don't have them. They don't exist. And they don't exist because they were not made. They don't exist because they have been destroyed by the weather, climate, etc. For the kind of reason that none of the pyramids that we excavate have all of the painting on them that we know now they would have had. It's all gone. Why? Weather takes it away. So it is quite understandable that we don't have any text, regardless of what the Book of Mormon says people were writing. It isn't surprising that any text from that time period is gone because based on what that area does to perishable material, it would have perished. Now, add to that the fact that there is a war of destruction where you're trying to get rid of the Nephites. We know that when people would come in from the outside and would take over a city, lots of things would, statues of the gods would get broken. Things would be defaced. In other words, you're trying to erase that people when you come in. And that's, a typical thing to have happened where you're trying to kind of erase their history and replace it with, this is us now, forget about it, we've conquered you, the past is gone. Well, we can see that because of the stone. But if you're trying to erase a people, what are you going to do with their records? You're going to erase them. Why did Mormon think he had to bury the archives? He was trying to preserve them because if he didn't, somebody would take them and destroy them. So with the combination of wasn't preservable, if it was on perishable material, it would have perished, and with the war of destruction that is said at the end of the Book of Mormon, the retention of that culture's paperwork, scripture, etc., highly unlikely that would survive that kind of intentional destruction of a culture.
Okay, so putting a fine point on this, if someone were to say that we have no archaeological evidence for ancient Nephites and Lamanites, and archaeology sort of disproves the Book of Mormon, there's no evidence for it, what would you say to that?
I would say that whoever's proposing that is not an archaeologist. It It is easy to say if you're an armchair outsider looking at archaeology and particularly looking at the old world and saying, this is what we know about the old world. The old world had writing that's been preserved. And so that changes things dramatically from when we get to the New World. When you get to the New World, because we don't have writing at multiple time periods, the rules have changed for interpretation. So John Clark, who is an archaeologist, was asked that question, do we have Nephite artifacts? And he says, yes, we've got thousands of Nephite artifacts. He says, they're all scattered through the best museums in the world. The problem is they don't say Nephite on them because it's an artifact. And until later, when they're painting their vases and things, you don't get indications of who this belonged to or what culture it was. And the example I always give, if my neighborhood, I'm one of the only LDS, well, I am the only LDS person, on my street. So you take the, 20 houses here, and somehow cataclysm happens, and 1,000 years from now, archaeologists come and dig up our houses. Will they be able to discern that I was LDS and everybody else wasn't? No. We share the same material culture. My pots and pans look just like my neighbor's pots and pans. The art I have on my wall isn't significantly different. Well, mine is because I'm weird.
So you don't label your pots and pans with "I'm LDS" on the bottom?
Only when you take them to the church for a potluck. Then you label. Other than that, no. So, I don't drive an LDS car. I don't live in an LDS house. My house looks like the house that was built next door kind of thing. So if it's material culture, archaeology deals in material culture. If you are part of a shared material culture, you can't tell who it was that had it. So you can say this artifact came from this site. Was it Nephite or Lamanite? I don't know. Nothing says because there's no writing to tell you.
So do you think it's almost a little bit of a red herring in the sense that it seems unlikely that archaeology will find definitive archaeological evidence to prove or disprove because we're not finding ancient names of these pre-classic cities. We're not finding ancient names, people that lived there. We're not finding ancient texts. We're just finding their material culture. And if there were historical Nephites that intermingled, they would have similar artifacts and material things as the rest of the culture.
There's no way to know that it would be a Book of Mormon artifact unless there was a written name on it that was a Book of Mormon name. That's the only way you could know. And if there's no preserved writing from that time period, you can't know. And, if you go to that period in the artifacts, they don't have names on them, Maya or Nephi. So, yeah, we just, because there's no preserved writing, we don't know. And let me give you an example from the Old World. There's writing all over the Old World. We have clay tablets from a couple of thousand years ago, a library of them. We have a wealth of written text coming out of the ancient Near East. And we have a lot of people who've been doing archaeology in the ancient Near East for a long time. And it wasn't until, let's say, within the last 50 years that somebody found an artifact that had David written on it that looked like it might be referring to King David. Now, here's the most revered person in Israelite history, King David. And it took that long for archaeologists to find a piece that verified that that was a real person. Okay? A lot of archaeology, a lot of written history, a lot of texts being written. It took them that long to find that. Okay? Pontius Pilate, they finally found an engraving on a stone. So we can say, yeah, Pontius Pilate was there. Now, we're sure he was because of writing. But it took a long time before they found that one stone that had his name on it. So you could say, here it was. Well, how did we know that they were there? Well, it was writing. If we don't have the writing, we can't tell. And, based on what we see in the Old World, it's extremely difficult to come up with that. So why do we know things in the Old World? Because the Old World has better retention of ancient names than we do in the New World. Names in the New World got mixed up with multiple cultures, multiple times, multiple places. So we don't have the ancient names of these sites. But we've always known where Jerusalem was. We still, for example, in the Bible, for all the archaeology that was done, there are arguments of where the city of Ai is, Ai. Still arguments about where that one would have been. And we know where lots of other ones were, and we know these. So even in the old world, there are things that we don't know, but there are a lot of things we know because of the nature of the old world that is categorically different from what happens in the new world.
This is important to consider when it comes to Book of Mormon archaeology and what we would expect to find. And, you know, when people say archaeology disproves the Book of Mormon or there's no archaeological evidence, it's also getting to what would we expect to find from what we know about the pre-classic Maya as well. Yeah. What would you say to a skeptic who might think like, well, this is just so convenient. It's sort of unfalsifiable and untestable. If they came and intermingled with the population there, then that's a very convenient way to get around the DNA problem. And this is a convenient way that, okay, we can't really falsify this then if we don't have ancient names of the cities, or we know the names of people there, or texts. You know, this doesn't support the Book of Mormon, but this also makes it hard to falsify it.
And the answer to that is, well, okay, in that case, what kind of argument can you make that could falsify the text? You take the text of the Book of Mormon and you say, I'm going to assume that this is an authentic text from the time period that it declares itself to be, and I will put it into an historical context that we know, although we don't have the names and we can't say this is exactly the place. Based on best evidence, this looks like where it could be. Put that text there and say, what is out of place or out of time? What fits, what does not fit? If you move through the text, does it vary from what we know of the archaeology, or does it follow the archaeology? Are there elements inside the text where you can say, this reflects what we know of the culture of the time? So what you do is you say, I'm going to take the text where I cannot prove one way or the other, but what I will do is find out if it is plausibly related to that, because I will put it in that context to see if it fits. And it's very easy to not fit. Okay? I assume that you are not a Mesoamerican expert.
I'm not.
Is that true?
I married a woman from Mexico, but no, that still doesn't make
close as we get. Okay. Okay,
get a little bit closer though.
That cheat, you know, with your wife is a cheat, okay? Write a history of, we'll simplify it, let's just Mexico. Write a history of central Mexico for me and try to make sure that you get all of the historical connections right, all of the conquests, all of the interactions, all of the way they ran their economic system. I'd like you to get that correct. What shot would you give yourself of being able to produce that?
Oh, pretty slim.
Yeah, exactly. If you take a text and you put it in a historical context and you say, I'm lucky because it fit right here. Well, then history changes. Does the text change with the history? Can you see it move through time? And that's what my Traditions of the Fathers book was doing.
Right. It's a different approach. It's not, can we find the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica? It's, can we find Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon? Does it converge culturally? Yes. Looking at warfare, the social and economic system. Like I was reading a chapter the other day in Helaman, and it mentioned like chief judges and lawyers and priests. And I was just like, let me just check, like, did those things exist in Mesoamerica during that time? I was like, oh yeah, they didn't. Like that. So those would be examples of things that sort of, and that would go beyond like a parallel like that, where you see things that seem to fit with the culture and time.
Yeah, and there's so many of them. And then what happens is once you say this fits into this culture and time, every once in a while you can say, oh, that culture and time actually explains something in the text better than it would if I didn't have that background. So for a quick example, you have King Benjamin who gives a speech, and he starts off his speech by saying, I'm not, you know, I'm basically this is I'm only something about.
I'm only like a mortal man.
Yeah, I'm a mortal man. Well, yeah, duh. But why would he say that? Well, there's a context behind it where the kings were treated as divine, and so he's defining himself against them. And then he goes and he says, "And I haven't done this, and I haven't done this, and I haven't done this." Why would you talk about the things that you have not done? Why does that help you? If you're discriminating yourself from what they know other kings are like, now that is a context that says, yeah, I know why you're saying that. I expect that from this guy, but you're different. And so the culture behind it begins to inform us of why we see the things that we do in King Benjamin's speech. And there are other places. One of them, Mark Wright noticed, and he said, we get Alma who is talking to the people in Zarahemla. And he says, do you have the image of God engraven on your faces? Well, that's an interesting idea, and it's a metaphor that we think of and we go, oh, yeah, that's kind of cool. And Mark pointed out, however, in Mesoamerica, that was literally true. That's how they identified the god, is they would take a mask that was literally engraven or carved, and they would put that carved mask on their face to have the image of God on their face so that they were related to that God. It's very literal in that culture. Why do you say engraven? Because that's what they did.
That's cool.
Now, we understand it and we can understand it outside of that culture. But if you've got that cultural background, all of a sudden, it's a richer meaning than we have if we don't have that background. And I think for people who say that, the archaeology doesn't prove or disprove, I don't think any of those things prove the Book of Mormon. What they do is say the Book of Mormon fits in that context. It is reasonably ancient in the way it behaves and the way it fits into Mesoamerica at the appropriate locations and at the appropriate time periods, and things will change over time so that what was appropriate in the land of Nephi is different from the end of times in Mormon. Things have changed, but they fit correctly to what we know. And so the Book of Mormon parallels history pretty nicely. That's really, really difficult to do. So I can't say that proves the Book of Mormon, but what does it lean in that direction?
Yeah, it's a different approach and methodology, but I find it really fascinating, all the cultural connections and things that correspond and converge. And on the one hand, like, it'd be nice if we found archaeologically a city that said ZRHML or something. But then at the same time, if nothing else sort of fits with the context or with the culture or the geography, you might be able to dismiss that like as could be a coincidence. So it's a different approach. Now, what would you say to someone in the past? Like, you probably heard of Thomas Stuart Ferguson,
Sure.
and then he lost his faith over archaeological excavations they were doing and they didn't find it. And there's that famous statement where he was like, well, the dirt in Mesoamerica will never align with the text. And do you think he was almost misguided, thinking that he would find like archaeological evidence to prove the Book of Mormon?
Oh, yeah, he absolutely was expecting to find certain things, and when he didn't find what he thought should have been found, then he lost his testimony, and it becomes a question of why did you think that was something that should have been found in the first place? So again, it was the original premise that was incorrect. He went into the archaeology assuming that there were things he would find. For instance, he would find Egyptian things. He would find Middle Eastern pots and pans, if you will, and you don't. And frankly, I would never have expected to see any of those. So yeah, he lost his testimony because he was looking for the wrong. He didn't find what he thought he should have found. No, he didn't. Then, I mean, he was a lawyer, not an archaeologist, so he wasn't used to interpreting the data and then trying to set it up against the Book of Mormon. So it was all unfortunate preconceptions on his part. Now his family has tried to sort of redeem him and say that he regained his testimony by the time he died, and I don't know how true that is, but they do. The family has reported that he had regained his testimony before he passed away.
Okay. And another thing people bring up that I forgot to mention is why aren't we finding written Hebrew or Egyptian, in
Yeah.
ancient Mesoamerica, and why aren't we finding like Jewish symbols, or if they're practicing the law of Moses, things that would support sort of law of Moses rituals?
Yeah. Why aren't we finding the writing? We've already talked about that. They wrote all kinds of things, perished. We just don't have anything from that time period. So
And do
there
you
could
also
have
believe they
been.
probably would have adopted the language when they were there as
Yeah, I
well?
mean, I really think that they're not going to be speaking Hebrew. Hebrew is going to be a scholarly language like Latin did. Becomes a dead language where the scholars learn it, and it's not a spoken language because you've got other languages you have to learn to be able to talk to people. Um, so that's the language. It gets more interesting when you say, why don't we find sort of Jewish symbols. And I've heard people say, well, why don't you find Christian symbols? Well, Christian symbols are really easy to figure out because the Christian symbols all borrowed from Greek, and they borrowed the imagery from the Greeks and then kind of redeveloped it. For example, all of the saints that we see with halos, the halos come from the sun god who had the sun disk behind his head. That got adopted into Christianity, and the sun disk turned into a halo. Um, the,
So they're borrowing and like repurposing the imagery and iconography from other
yeah,
cultures.
we don't know what Christ looked like. I mean, there were no painters at the time who said, "Yeah, this is his portrait." So everybody, had an artistic image of Christ. The earliest ones borrowed from Apollo, and they used Apollo's imagery to say this is Christ. And then apparently they shifted to Zeus and to the image that was of Zeus in the temple, which was this longer haired, bearded guy, which basically is the typical Christ that we see. When you see the prototypical Christ with the beard and the hair and everything, that's probably a remnant of Zeus, not Christ. The Jews did a lot of the same kind of thing. But the next thing you have to remember is that the Jews were adamantly aniconic, meaning they did not want to have representations of deity. So first of all, they're not going to have representations of deity that they're going to bring with them because they don't have them. Okay, there's nothing to bring with them because they didn't exist. They were aniconic. You don't expect people to have lots of monuments of the gods. However, you would expect that they would merge with symbology that was available in the same way that people in the old world did, where the Christians adopted Greek. You would expect that people would take the images that were familiar and they would then adopt them. So it would not be surprising at all if for many of the Nephites, the Maya corn god, or whichever culture corn god it was, the corn god became associated with Christ. Certainly did later. But why would you use the corn god? Because it's a symbol of death and resurrection. The corn god goes down as a dead seed and comes up in a live plant. So there's reason to believe that they might have borrowed that imagery. But that borrowing of imagery went on in the old world, and we see it with the Greeks, we see it with other cultures around. And so there's no reason to believe that a human population would not do the same kind of thing in the New World. So, why don't we find that it should not have existed? If it existed ever, it would have been for a short period of time, and it's long gone.
What's your thoughts on, a few years ago, the discoveries with LIDAR technology? So it discovered more like network of cities, highways, fortifications, more agriculture, and I think just the vast population size. Does this in any way, is it supportive of the Book of Mormon, the discoveries? Does it even match with Book of Mormon geography? What do you make of the LIDAR technology discoveries?
The one place where it absolutely supports the Book of Mormon is how many people were there. The Book of Mormon talks about lots and lots of people, and it assumes a very heavily populated area. Everything you see in the text is there were lots of people around.
And talks about like raised highways as well, doesn't it, in certain parts?
You certainly get raised highways in the Yucatan. I don't know that we found any outside of that. In the Grijalva River Basin, I don't know that we've found any. But since it's underwater and they didn't do a lot of excavations, I don't know how much we could have found. If it's there, it's underwater and we can't find it. But certainly the LIDAR has shown that these roads there were many more of them than we had expected. They're much longer. They connect cities over longer distances. So raised roads, yes, there's tons of them now, way more than we ever thought. Much more population than we ever thought. And then, of course, a lot more cities than anybody has suspected. But basically, the shock is how many more people there were in Mesoamerica than we had ever thought.
Mm.
And of course, that correlates to the fact that the Book of Mormon basically assumes that there are lots and lots and lots of people.
Right, right. Well, have you looked at the other Mesoamerican geography model proposed by Richard Terry? I did an interview with him and oh flip, I can't remember the guy. Robert Roylance? I don't remember.
Yeah,
But I
yeah,
had them
yeah,
on like a year or two ago and we
yeah, yeah.
talked about their
Uh,
model. What do you make of it? Do you think the geography works? Because in some ways it could still maintain a lot of the cultural correspondences, but it's a different
yeah,
geography.
it's still there. There's still a lot of the cultural stuff that does. What happens with that one is that it's one of the models that uses a very north-south orientation, so that north is the Peten. And I think as soon as you try to define the Peten as north, you hit problems. You just don't have enough space to make anything work. Um, you they're just well, and the one that I can't make work if I'm heading up north, those are all Maya languages, and if you get back far enough, they may have some dialectical differences, but I don't think they're mutually unintelligible at Book of Mormon times. The problem with the Book of Mormon is you have the Nephite speakers with Mosiah who meet up with the people in Zarahemla, and they're
Oh,
not speaking
yes.
the same language. So we have two unintelligible languages. How do I get that? Where do I find that condition? I don't find it in that vertical north-south because at that point in time, they're probably speaking, even if it's dialectically different, mutually intelligible languages where there are some differences, but you can talk to each other. Um, when you head to the Sorensen correlation, now you're coming out of a Maya area and you're meeting Soke, and those are unintelligible languages. So I think that fits the Sorensen better.
And
Um,
Jerry also doesn't think the geology fits as well with their model as it does with the Sorensen model. It corresponds much better with the San Martin volcano and
yeah,
earthquake. He doesn't think it would account for all the specific destruction in their model.
yeah, and I think that is some of the most solid work that Jerry Grover has done. I highly recommend that book.
Yeah,
Well, the last half of that book. The first half of that book is about geology, and you have
close your eyes
to
through it.
you have to skip. Go through it quickly. It's there because it's important background, and the interesting stuff is at the end. But yeah, it's a solid book, and I think he's persuasive about
Mm.
that.
Yeah, and it's another sort of witness, or it's something, another discipline to sort of verify and support John Sorensen's geography. I find the
Yeah,
geology probably one of the strongest convergences. Um,
yeah.
I don't know if you want to maybe do another episode because I have a few more points I wanted to ask you, but I know we're going a bit long. Would you want
Yeah,
to do a part
we can
two
do
maybe, or
another one
just
sometime.
yeah? Well, I'll maybe just ask you one or two last questions just on like sort
Sure.
of Mesoamerica stuff. Oh, I want to ask you this. So I came across this in Sorensen's book, and I don't know if this is like legit or not because I know this came out in the 1980s, and I'd never heard of it before. But it was some Stella. Let's see, I have the page, and I'd never heard of this before. Um, Laventa Stela 3, and it says this massive monument dating about the 6th century BC seems to show the meeting of leaders of two ethnic groups. The man on the right looks very much like a Jew of that time, courtesy Kirk Mackleby. And I can't find the page, but he talked about it on a page a bit.
Yeah,
I was like, I've never heard of this. What do you make of that? Is there anything to that?
I have seen the Stella. It is highly weathered, and because it's coming out of Jaredite Olmec times, it's old and therefore highly weathered. It does appear that there are people wearing two different kinds of regalia. So the idea that there are two different peoples that are talking to each other that are being represented seems to be correct. The idea that it's Jewish is, I think, not as solid. I think they're reading, a hooked nose and a beard where it's going to be very difficult to tell if that's really what's there. Um, so the stela exists, and having looked at it, I think it really does indicate a meeting of two people. Saying that one of them was Jewish, I think, is farther than I would be willing to go.
Okay, no, appreciate that. I guess last question. You probably remember the Fair Conference, an article done by Mark Wright on Heartland as Hinterland, because at the end of the Book of Alma, it talks about northward migrations, and he sort of gave it as a way to like harmonize Mesoamerica, but also like statements about like Zelf or Lamanites, up in Missouri. What do you think about that? Like, it's a little bit speculative, but I think he gives some reasons why we might see archaeologically some northward
It's
migrations.
not, the only thing that's speculative is that the people who went there were Nephites. That's the speculative part. The fact that Mesoamericans traveled up through there, absolutely true. We have archaeological information. We have trade routes that we know that they're going all over the place. So saying that Mesoamericans went from their area and moved into what we would call the southern and central parts of the United States, so that there were Mesoamerican peoples who had come there, absolutely archaeologically definable. So yes, that part of it is okay. The speculative part is that some of them could have called themselves Nephites. That's speculation. The connection is not. The connection is solid. We know that was there. It is after Book of Mormon times that all of this happens, but one of the really important and large sites in the United States was Cahokia. And when you see reconstructions of Cahokia, you say, that looks like the Mesoamerican people built that. And it really does. It's, archaeologically, the way things are laid out, you're going, yeah, that's the Mesoamerican people who come up and built up Cahokia. The idea that there were Mesoamericans there, pretty solid.
Okay. And last question, in 1 or 2 minutes, can you summarize? We've done loads of episodes on Mesoamerica, convergences, you've written books on it. Can you in 1 or 2 minutes summarize why you find Mesoamerica the most plausible geographical model for the Book of Mormon as opposed to elsewhere?
Because I can't find anything else where the Book of Mormon fits comfortably. I don't have to force anything in the Book of Mormon. I can put the Book of Mormon in that context, and it's comfortable there. It fits with the history. It fits with the way we can see how the cultures interacted. It fits over time. It helps me explain the Book of Mormon. I cannot put the Book of Mormon anywhere else and find that. If I put the Book of Mormon, let's say, in the Heartland, does the Heartland ever help me understand the Book of Mormon? Never. Not a single thing about the Heartland makes the Book of Mormon more intelligible. Does the Mesoamerican context make the Book of Mormon more intelligible? Yes. That's my reasoning.
Those are fighting words, Brant. Fighting words.
Yeah, try.
Well, Brant, this has been a fun.
It's not the notes.
I'm gonna get a lot of angry Heartlanders in the comments for what you said there.
Oh yeah,
But Brant,
that'll happen. It's not a surprise. They are well aware of my preferences.
well, hey, all engagement's positive engagement on YouTube. Helps me with my videos. Well, Brant, this has been a fun discussion. I'm struggling to think how I'm going to title the video because we've just been talking about all things Book of Mormon. Maybe it'll just be all things Book of Mormon. But it's been really fun. We're probably going to have to do a part 2 because I've still got more questions I want to ask you on like 19th century elements in the Book of Mormon. But it's been fun to just chat about these things. And I think especially to address the archaeological concerns. I'm glad that we covered that. We've hinted on it in previous episodes, but it's important, and it's been fun to have you back on.
Well, thanks. It's been fun.
Yeah.
Do it again.
Yeah, we'll do it again soon. And listeners who've been watching, if you've enjoyed it, give it a like, comment as well. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll link where you could get some of Brant's books and articles as well. Maybe you could send me links to some of your recent articles on some things. And come back for part 2. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.